thank you for joining us this evening at the Mark Twain Library for another installment of our Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy series presented by the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library. My name is Erin Dumeyer, and I'm the director of Mark Twain Library. In a moment, I'm going to let tonight's moderator introduce our guest speaker, but first I'd like to tell you a little bit about our award-winning conversation series and also a bit about how to participate in tonight's program. Conversations, Truth, Myth, and Democracy is a series of lectures and events created by the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters. Winner of the 2022 Connecticut Library Association's Award for Excellence in Public Library Service, the series began in the fall of 2019 to continue the community conversation on issues of race, justice, and democracy. Just a quick thank you to area libraries and leagues for their support of tonight's program. Easton Public Library, Weston Public Library, Friends of the Weston Public Library, Newtown C.H. Booth Library, Richfield, Woodbury, and the League of Women Voters of Weston, the League of Women Voters of Richfield, and the League of Women Voters of Northern Fairfield County. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our host for tonight's program. Dr. Daniel W. Barrett is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Western Connecticut State University and a member of the Conversations Committee. A former resident of Reading, he graduated with a BA from Wesleyan University, earned his PhD in social psychology from Arizona State, and served as a postdoctoral research fellow in health communication at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Erin. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another event in our series of conversations on truth, myth, and democracy. I want to thank the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters, of which I am a proud member, for organizing tonight's event. Today, I'm very excited to have the opportunity and the privilege to chat with Richard Slotkin. Dr. Slotkin is the Olin Professor of American Studies Emeritus at Wesleyan University. He's an author, cultural critic, and historian who is a three-time finalist for the National Book Award. His latest book, which we'll talk about tonight, is called A Great Disorder, National Myth and the Battle for America. It's been longlisted for the National Book Award. In addition to his most recent work, he's the author of Lost Battalions, a New York Times notable book, an award-winning trilogy on the myth of the frontier in America. And the titles of those books were Regeneration Through Violence, The Fatal Environment, and Gunfighter Nation, as well as 3 historical novels. I could say more, but I'm going to stop there and go on with our program. Rich, thanks for taking time to speak with me tonight. I imagine that with your book having just been released and given so much acclaim, that you have a lot of requests for interviews and book signings, what have you. So I thank you very much for taking time tonight to talk with us.
It's my great pleasure to do so.
And your book is a good fit for this series because you explore some of the most important national myths that have helped Americans define what it has meant and what it means to be authentically American. In this context, myths are not necessarily untrue or fantastical, rather they're grand narratives that weave together events and themes and offer explanations for and provide meanings to our national history. I have dozens of books on my shelf over there, all about the cultural divide and political polarization, some of which are full of experimental and correlational studies and talk about how and why we're divided. And your book is different, in that you connect these cultural divisions with these grand narratives of American history. And so it's a really different way of thinking about polarization than many of the books that political scientists, sociologists, and others have put forth. And these grand narratives or myths, as you call them, provide us with frameworks for understanding, again, who and what we are. And they may or may not be consistent with one another, as you'll talk about later on tonight. Again, you're not really concerned about their absolute truth or falsity, with debunking them or validating them, but with revealing their existence and their influence over us as Americans. And then toward the end, you use these myths as a lens for examining our current political predicament, our polarization, and the upcoming or really ongoing elections since voting started, last week in many places. So I look forward to chatting with you tonight. I have a series of questions to get us going, and I suspect I have more than I'll have time for. And around 8:30 or so, we'll stop. I'll turn to audience questions. So against audience members, please put your questions in the Q&A, and then we'll wrap up around 9 p.m. So let's spend the first part of our time together talking about the myths themselves. And later on, we'll talk about our current environment, politics, the election, and so forth. So let's kind of break it down to the two parts tonight. So before we talk about the myths, why don't you tell us, why did you decide to write this book?
Uh, well, there were really two impulses here. I felt in my earlier work I had focused on the myth of the frontier, which is arguably the central myth of American nationality. But I had perhaps neglected some other myths that are equally or comparably important. And the, uh, the need to do so, the need to address that, was really aroused by the later years of the Trump administration, starting really with the demonstrations in Charlottesville, where it was clear to me that the banners that the MAGA people were carrying, and to some extent their opponents as well, that each of these banners was like an icon behind which was a story or myth of American nationality. And that in bringing these banners to the field, what they were doing was seeking to project or impose a particular narrative, a particular way of looking at American history. The example that I began with there with Charlottesville is the lost cause, the Confederate-centered myth of the Civil War, which holds that the South was right. Slavery was not a terrible institution. The South was right to defend it, and the South was right to use violence to overthrow Reconstruction and reestablish white supremacy in the wake of the Civil War. And that really, that myth of white restoration, it's really also white Christian restoration, seemed to me the master story behind the Trump banners. There were others as well, but that was the one that really got me started on the book.
Okay, we'll come back to that myth in a few minutes here. Let me just start with the first myth in your book, the myth of the frontier, and you call that the oldest and most enduring of these major myths. So, can you tell us more about that, what that myth is, and kind of where it came from?
Okay, well, just to step back a second, myths are stories that accumulate around uh, crises or aspects or conflicts in American historical development that are of ongoing or permanent significance. And therefore, although they can be explained initially by the people who first experience them, nobody can leave it alone. People keep re-explaining and adding new things to it. So you really go back to the origins of the United States. We begin as a settler state, a colonial settler state of English, mainly English, but white European colonies on the eastern coast of the North American continent. And the drive of those colonists to establish their societies in the wilderness, to displace the indigenous peoples, and to prosper from the acquisition of these new natural resources that the wilderness held, is the first story of American national existence. And because our national development was really centered on westward expansion for something like 300 years, from 1600, from Jamestown to 1900, to the turn of the 20th century. That story is fundamental to the way Americans think of themselves. And there were really two aspects to that myth, which again are the fundamentals of myth making in general. The first is that what I call an American theory of capitalism, which is that you don't accumulate wealth or property by the sweat of your brow or the sweat of someone else's brow. You do it by conquering unoccupied, supposedly unoccupied. Indians don't count.
Right. Supposedly, yeah.
Wilderness land. You appropriate vast natural resources. And what you get is not simply a nice piece of property. You get a windfall of wealth. You get a freehold, a farm, modest by our standards, 40 acres. By the standards of the English peasantry or the French peasantry, it's a baronial estate. Moreover, as the population grows, the value of that piece of property grows and grows and grows from year to year. Now add into that the possibility that your property will have valuable natural resources, timber, furs at the beginning, but later on, minerals, gold, iron, steel, coal, oil, ultimately,
Wow. Mhm.
as the source, not simply of a nice turn of profit, but a return on investment so vast as to seem almost magical and to override the apparent costs of achieving that wealth. So that's the frontier theory of American economics. And the second piece of it goes to the question of social or national identity. And that is to get these resources, you as white person have to displace the indigenous non-white people. And I would add into that or exploit African slave labor as well. Um, and so that from the beginning, the expectation of wealth through natural resources is the American thing. But being white, uh, uh, the difference between white and non-white is the defining characteristic of American nationality. Um, I emphasize that because the ethnic origins of those white settlers, even the very first ones coming over from England, there's tremendous ethnic difference
Yep.
between Scots, Irish, Scots-Irish, Cornish, East Anglian, and then, of course, French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, High
Well,
German,
in fact,
Italian,
many
Dutch.
weren't even considered white, right? So many of them came over here, and for a long time they weren't even considered white. They were called something else. They were called
That's right.
non-white or
That's
black or
right.
something else. But
That's right.
so what we now call white, we didn't call white for much of our history.
That's right. But in this initial phase uh, of nation formation, the distinction which is made in law and in culture is white versus non-white. You
Hmm.
don't have to be English to be American. You can be Scots to be American, but you can't be black. You can't be red.
Hmm.
Uh, and from once that basis is established, you have a kind of template for talking about other differences that occur down the line. So when you get immigrants from countries that are not in that original grab bag, the Northern European grab bag, when you get Southern Italians, you get East European Jews, you get Slavs, you get Poles, you get Asians. The question is, are they more like the white people we are familiar with, or do they in some way resemble more closely blacks and Indians? And that scale is applied. Well, yes, say the savants, these people are primitives, socially primitive, ethnically primitive, racially primitive, and therefore, while they're not black, they are closer to the black or red end of the spectrum than they are to the pure white end of the spectrum. And that is the initial response to the what are so-called the new immigrants that come in the start coming in the
Hmm.
late 19th century. The Irish, when they start coming over, are in cartoons. They're likened to apes. And in that regard, they are cartooned like black people.
Hmm. So, and even I had this conversation a week and a half ago with Dr. Ellen Umansky from
Yeah.
Fairfield University about anti-Semitism. We talked
Yes.
about this very thing with regards to how Jews were defined variously throughout our history, which we don't, but that's a sort of separate topic than tonight's topic. But we had a conversation about that anyway in some depth. So, one thing that strikes me about this frontier mythology is that the myth the frontier, sorry, isn't, we don't have a frontier anymore. It's gone. So yet this mythology is still with us today. And I guess in a small way, somebody might say the Mexican border is a frontier that we have to defend. So rather than being one to expand out into, maybe we defend it. Some people might look at it that way. Or the oil reserves in Alaska are still a sort of a frontier that, well, do we
Yes.
exploit them or do we save them? But aside from that, we don't really have a frontier anymore. So how is it that this mythology is still so powerful today?
Well, the original myth of the frontier, which was based on the acquisition of land, basically, and agrarian resources, and extractive natural resources. Starting in the end of the 19th century, it was reinterpreted to say that new technologies could unleash wealth, could lead to wealth on that same exponential scale as the discovery of gold in California would have done. And so, and the result and the proof of that this is a new frontier, is that you get exponential growth. So the growth of of big business, big industrial business at the end of the 19th century, railroads in particular,
Mhm.
steel business, steel making business, is seen as a kind of new frontier. But now we talk about the Silicon Valley frontier, the frontiers of technology. The word frontier appears in popular economics books by right wingers and by liberals like Robert Reich. The idea that the frontier, once the myth is established as a story, what we do is we take symbols from it and we apply them to make a kind of analogy between something that's going on now and the content
Mhm.
of the myth. So yeah, technological frontier. Look at the wealth that Silicon Valley has generated. Is it not magical in its scale? Is it not beyond all rational expectation? Uh,
Mhm.
Bitcoin, mining the Bitcoin frontier. It's like mining gold in California. Today that Bitcoin is worth 15 cents, tomorrow it'll be worth $60,000.
Mhm.
That is the frontier myth applied by analogy to
Right,
a post
re-envisioned.
to what you would call literally a post-frontier situation. Space, the final frontier. The
Right.
ocean, the final frontier, because it's an undeveloped region from which we can extract this magical wealth.
Mhm. That's really interesting. Let me go on to your second myth then, which is the myth of the founding.
Yeah.
Obviously, referring to the founding of the United States. And so, what is the myth, and how did it evolve over time? When did it emerge? So, what did it sort of start right away with a declaration? Did it come after the Constitution, was approved? So, and how did this myth develop in the early years, and kind of where is it today?
Well, the myth in its simplest terms is that the United States, as a state, as a government, was founded by an extraordinarily wise and virtuous group of white men in the late 18th century. And they gave us two sacred documents: the Declaration of Independence, which is a radical and revolutionary statement of principles. Revolutionary in the literal sense that it talks about these are the reasons for overthrowing the government. And the Constitution, which only mentions overthrowing the government in giving the power of the president the power to suppress an insurrection. It's law. It's a structure of law. And in a sense, in a conceptual sense, these two documents represent the fundamental antithesis or conflict at the heart of our government or of any government, which is the war between justice and law, between revolutionary principle and the necessities of governance. Now, when that story becomes a myth, what we have to say is that the process of myth making is simply a process of repeated storytelling. So the frontier myth is produced by repeated tellings of frontier adventure stories. Um, and the same is true of the founding fathers. While the founding fathers are active politicians, of course, we are rehearsing their careers and the meaning of their careers. But I think the where I would locate the moment when they become mythic would be July 4th, 1826, when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who represent the ideological poles of American politics, Adams for law and constitution, Jefferson, Declaration and Revolution, they die
Right,
within
the same
hours of
day.
each other on the same
Mm-hmm.
day, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, if that is not a sign of God's providence, I don't know what is.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
that ratifies the fact that for that 50-year period, we have been using those documents to structure and account for our lives. And now we have a fable. Now we have a story that explains the origins of those things we have been using in a heroic way. And so what will then follow is playing out through the rest of our history, the argument between the radical egalitarianism of the Declaration and the limitations of the law in the Constitution. Um, the fight over slavery is, in my view, the thing that really turns the founding into a myth, because both sides in that 40-year intense argument go back to the founding and retell the story of the founding to justify their position. Lincoln goes back to the Declaration of Independence
Mm-hmm.
is the moral core of what the Constitution is supposed to achieve. Now, there's nothing in the writings of the founding fathers that says anything like that. That's his story. That's his way of putting the
Right.
story together. And Southern apologists for slavery say, well, nothing of the kind. And moreover, Jefferson never intended to include blacks in the category of humanity. And the point is not that one was right and the other was wrong. The point was that the argument kept going on and on and on. And every time the argument invoked the founding, the myth of the founding became more and more a part of our discourse.
Mm-hmm. Well, even now, there's a different version or a different argument about that myth, and that is their idea of originalism. So, what did they actually mean? Here we have this document that we've been arguing about for 200 years or more, and we still don't know or claim we don't know what it was they meant when they wrote those words. And so, there's, as you know, a huge argument now about what would they hit? How would those things apply to what we know today about guns or
Yeah,
about other kinds of freedoms, what have you? And so these arguments still haven't gone away and probably never will. I don't see us ever
that's right.
coming to an agreement on that. Do you?
No, and that is why it's a myth, because the conflict that is at the heart of the story is one that has no conceivable ending. The
Mhm.
principles involved are so fundamentally different that, until you achieve utopia, the end of history, it's not going to end. Same with the frontier. Until there is no longer an economy of growth, the conflicts at the heart, the moral choices at the heart of the frontier myth will have to constantly be negotiated. Sometimes we'll even take the Indian point of view in telling that story. But that's the point. It embodies a conflict that remains fundamental to the society. And that's why we keep going back to the story.
Mhm. So let's go on to your third myth or set of myths, really about the Civil War.
Yeah.
And you talk about the myth of liberation, the myth of the white union, and also the myth of the lost cause. And so let's just start with the liberation myth. So what is that? I know it's about Lincoln and about what he did or didn't do with regard to slavery. Tell us more about what that liberation myth is.
The liberation myth is that the Civil War was a war that did two things. It saved government of the people, by the people, for the people, by establishing the principle that, as Lincoln said, when ballots have achieved a fair result, there can be no resort to bullets, and therefore that the civil law of a republic is supreme. And the second thing is that who is we the people? And what Lincoln says, in effect, is we the people now includes those who were formerly enslaved, those who with black skin. And that is a revolutionary, a fundamental change in the way American nationality is presented and conceived. And it's also a change in the way government is perceived, because now the national government is supreme. The national government representing the whole people must be the supreme government. And that Lincoln myth is or that version of the Civil War certainly shapes the Reconstruction movement, the attempts to reconstruct the South. And it's a set of symbols to which we often revert during periods of massive social reform. So that Lincoln comes back as a figure in the progressive era, 1910s and 20s. He's a very important symbol in the 1930s during the New Deal. And he especially comes back with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The image of Martin Luther King speaking on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, literally at Lincoln's feet, is the modern coming of age, really, and application of the liberation myth.
Well, it's certainly Reconstruction, which was part of that mythology, then becomes counteracted by the Lost Cause mythology,
Yeah.
right? And that actually sort of destroys, undermines Reconstruction. And then we talk about the 60s as being a second Reconstruction in some cases, in some
Yes.
senses.
Yes.
So can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. The Lost Cause is a complex business because its fundamental story structures are laid down by the South in the post-Civil War defense of slavery. We were right to defend slavery. But really in the insistence that white supremacy must be reestablished through the overthrow of governments led by Black people and Northern liberals. And that's a peculiarly Southern myth, a key to Southern identity. Now, it becomes national when in the Gilded Age, when a couple of different things are happening nationally in the North as well. In the North, the industrialization of the economy is creating a growing class gap between the working class, the artisan class, and the corporate ownership class. And the class warfare is breaking out between organized or labor attempting to organize, and the heads of the new big business corporations. And while that class disorder is breaking out in the North, the ethnic and racial composition of the Northern working class is being altered partly by the outmigration of Blacks, but mainly by the immigration of what I've called before the new immigrants, the immigrants from nations outside of the old sources in Northern Europe. That is to say, Asia, China and Japan, on the West Coast especially, but not exclusively. And on the East Coast, Poland, the Slavic countries, East European Jews, Italians, especially Southern Italians, and to a certain extent also Mexicans, if we're talking about this late 19th century period. And so what happens to the leaders of opinion in the North, the cultural elite, the economic elite, is that they sour on the idea of democracy. That how can you trust democracy to people who, as the editor, E.L. Godkin, the editor of The Nation, a liberal magazine, pro-union magazine, says, who carry in their very blood principles which are inimical to civilization. That, in other words, these people are an alien race like the Indians, who can't be civilized and who must simply be repressed. And so you get in the North an analogy or a parallel to the South's repression of Black labor, to the racialization of class structure in the North, and the idea that you have to overthrow or undo the principles of democracy in order to establish control by the best people and the native born. So you get movements in the North led by people who identify as progressives, like John R. Commons, Theodore Roosevelt to some extent, who think about limiting the franchise, limiting the vote, because the vote, you can't trust the Irish, you can't trust the Italians, you can't trust the Jews with the vote that you used to trust to your Northern European white people. And that is directly analogous to the lost cause. And finally, one last thing. The lost cause in the South won because it licensed itself to commit acts of atrocious violence. And the same thing happened in the North. The story of labor relations in the North throughout the late 19th century up to the 1930s is marked by massive outbreaks of violence between strikers and strike breakers, between strikers and goon squads hired by the employers, to a remarkable extent, greater than in, say, for example, in England. Much more violence in the American, and it's justified, again, as the lost cause is justified, as to put the Indians back in their place, to put the savages back in their place.
Yeah, so the way you talk about the North is actually really interesting for a lot of people, because we think about the North as being this place of tolerance, social justice, all the repression that was down in the South. They had the Jim Crow stuff. They had all these horrible the lynchings and other things that were going on down there. But us in the North, we were the enlightened ones at that time, and clearly we really weren't in a lot of ways.
No, the new immigration was a test of those egalitarian principles, and it was a test that the country failed.
You know, and even now, I don't want to jump to the present too much yet, but you hear folks talking about repressing the vote again, and not just in terms of disenfranchisement of felons or whatever, but actually there are people talking about women should not be allowed to vote, and for reasons you've already talked about, because we can't trust them, because they're too emotional, because they're too whatever. And it's astounding to me that here we are in 2024, and there are people becoming louder and actually saying, let's scale that back. Let's go back to some prior time in American history. It's quite horrifying, to tell you the truth.
Christian nationalists as well talk
Yes.
about privileging the Christian voters over non-Christians. In the new conservatism website, there are some articles that call for that rationalize disenfranchisement on that basis. But so one can conceive of a movement to call for those things in order to establish, a certain kind of regime emerging from nowhere, or from purely immediate conflicts. And I guess my point is that what myths teach us is that the roots of these conflicts go deep in the society, and that American culture, through these mythic narrative patterns, has developed fixed themes or fixed motives for rationalizing, particularly the use of violence to achieve a public end. Violence to get the wealth of the frontier, violence to free the slaves, violence to reestablish white supremacy. It's critical to see that those who call for violence are appealing to traditions that are sanctified in our history.
So let's go on then to the fourth big myth. You talk about the myth of the good war.
Right.
And you state that at the turn of the 20th century, American national mythology had developed a distinctly ethno-nationalist character,
right,
equating patriotism with the maintenance of white racial ethnic supremacy and treating democracy as a secondary value. And you just talked about that a little bit. Can you just tell everybody what does ethno-nationalism mean in this context? And then what was this good war mythology? How did it develop? And what was the role of Hollywood, which you talk about in the book quite a bit, in developing, creating, perpetuating this mythology?
Okay, but ethno-nationalism is essentially that the national that one can only belong to the nation if one belongs to a particular ethnicity. And I use ethnicity rather than race because, in a technical sense, the ethnicities that comprise the American identity, even in that most restricted period, are varied. There are people from varied backgrounds. Um, uh, but and the ethno-nationalist program also insists that certain white-skinned people, certain white race people, can't qualify to belong to the nation state because something in their character makes them incapable of being good citizens. Uh, um, uh, uh, Italians, the Dillingham Report, famously of 1911, which was a committee to develop a new immigration restriction program, said Italians have a racial propensity for certain forms of criminality. Um, so ethno-nationalism says, yeah, being white isn't quite enough. You have to be a certain kind of white. And that's why I said ethno-nationalism rather than simply white nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you look again back at that lexicon of American myths, the story of the frontier, the story of the founding, the story of the liberation, the story of the lost cause, in every one of those stories, a white America embodied in a hero does something wonderful. But it's a white America that does it. Even
Mm-hmm.
the liberation in the Civil War, it's Lincoln, not
Right.
Frederick Douglass. It's Lincoln that does
Mm-hmm.
it. It's the white Union
And the white soldiers in the
and the
North.
white
Yeah.
soldiers, even though 1/10 of the soldiers were black by the end of the war.
Mm-hmm.
It's the white soldiers that are thought of. Even in Ken Burns's documentary, he focuses on the reunion of the white soldiers at Gettysburg in North and South in 1913 uh, over the corpse of black equality, basically. Um, what's different about the good war myth is that the good war, envisioned by Hollywood originally, embodies the nation in a multi-ethnic and multiracial platoon, which is fighting an enemy that is both racist and monoracial. Japanese are represent, of course, monoracial and are likened to Indians, of course, but they're
Mm-hmm.
also in the movies their racist sense of racial superiority is often mentioned by their propagandists. And of course, the Nazis are a racist power. And against the racial and racist powers stands a multi-ethnic platoon representing the different parts of the American population. And this is a Hollywood fantasy. The key movie here is a movie called Bataan. Came out in 1943. And the idea is that the Philippines is about to fall. The American army is cracked up. And a last stand has to be made to defend a bridgehead by a pickup squad from different elements of a racially segregated army. So in this unit, this pickup squad is a Jew, an Irishman, a Pole, two different kinds of Filipinos, two different kinds of Asians, a Moro, a Muslim, and a Tagalog, and some varieties of a college boy, an urban gangster, the different types of WASPs, a tough sergeant, and a Quaker to represent some ideological and social differences. And in the platoon is a black man who is serving in a segregated engineering unit and is now integrated into this white platoon. And he's one of the boys. There's no discrimination against him. Nobody even notices that he's black. The only black thing he does is he sings a spiritual while he's digging a foxhole. So okay, so we're serious about his being black. That is a revolutionary thing. You couldn't see that movie in some southern theaters; they wouldn't show it, or they showed it to in
Right.
a theater. They had special showings for blacks to come in, so the blacks and whites wouldn't sit together while watching this movie about blacks and whites together fighting the Japanese. And it's not a one-off. It's the theme is repeated in Sahara. Uh, it's varied in a movie called Guadalcanal Diary. The Marines are all white, but there's a black sailor who tells him, "Oh, this is what's going to happen when you get ashore in Guadalcanal." Um, and Hollywood makes the point that the government supports it. The government likes the idea. It's a little leery about pushing too fast with desegregation. The American Army in World War II is more segregated than it is even in World War I. Much harder for blacks to get into combat in World War II than it was in World War I. But despite that, Hollywood is projecting this idealized image, and the government sees that there is something there. That's a good look for us. After the war, when we're confronting the Soviet Union and Chinese in a struggle for control of the decolonizing third world, the dark peoples, segregation becomes a real ideological liability. And this image of the platoon is amplified in movies about the Korean War, some retrospectives about World War II, to emphasize the Black present. The case I like to cite most sharply is there's a movie called Home of the Brave, which was based on a
I don't know what.
based on a Pulitzer Prize stage play about anti-Semitism, a Jewish soldier dealing with anti-Semitism in the Pacific War. When they take the script and make a movie out of it, they change the Jewish guy to a black guy. Now that's making a statement. And that
Mhm.
tendency grows in Hollywood, really culminating in 1960 in a couple of real blockbuster movies about Korea that feature the role played by black soldiers. And so our image of the victory in World War II, the good war, the war that had to be fought, the war against the worst people in the world, the worst politics in the world, was fought by a diverse America, let's call it. And it was our
Mhm.
diversity that was our strength. It was the war that united us. The two things go together. And that is the first time these images, these movies, are the first time in a mass culture form that the United States is personified as racially and ethnically diverse, as opposed to
Mhm.
being white guys doing stuff. And that's a remarkable shift. Now, let me just add, there are continuities here. There's still an enemy, the Japanese. If there wasn't
Mhm.
an enemy, would really be hanging out with each other? And what is it that sort of ratifies our brotherhood? Violence. It's a war.
Mhm.
So the theme of violence persists. The theme of race persists, but now there's been a major change in the way that race can be handled.
So one of the things about this mythology I'm wondering about is whether it's going to weaken over time with regards to the good war. And I say that because the movies you talked about, the TV shows, the books, all were from our grandparents or parents' generations, and people who are raised today who are in their teens, 20s, 30s, or they're actually even post Vietnam, right? There are some of them even post Afghanistan now, at least the early Afghanistan and early Iraq war. So they don't have that mythology around them anymore. It is in the history books. They hear about it from their grandparents or from watching Ken Burns or whatever, documentaries. But is this mythology possibly going to weaken over time as the memories of that so-called good war kind of fade away?
Yes and no. Let me do the yes first.
Right.
That it won't fade away. Um, World War II movies are still coming out. I mean, Saving Private Ryan, Band of
True.
Brothers, whatever the new one is that Tom Hanks has done. So the good war hasn't gone away yet. And the second thing is that in the post-Vietnam period, when we didn't want to think about war so much anymore, we shifted the war into the world of science fiction. So you think about the crew of the Starship Enterprise as a platoon, and they bond together. They can accept anybody on that starship, except those damn Romulans. You know, there's always one group that can't. We can assimilate a Borg, we can assimilate a Klingon to our crew, but you know the Romulans. You know, you got to have some enemy that you have that fighting you that enemy holds you together. But the story. My point is that even though the first form of the story may lose its hold, and I'm not sure it has, but let's say it does, it is translated into other forms. So the original frontier, Daniel Boone, gives way to Buffalo Bill and General Custer, gives way to Bill Gates. Um, uh, uh,
Somehow it's hard to picture them as
yeah,
in a line, but what you're saying makes sense. But it's just a
yeah,
funny way to think about those
that's
individuals as
right.
being continuous in some way.
That's right.
Yeah.
If they're acting out the same script, then they belong in that story frame. And that's what I'm saying, that our science fiction stories belong in that story frame. I'd even tentatively make a case for the Marvel universe, where you have invented mutant races,
Hmm.
who again are, joined together to a common enemy. So there's that. Now, here's the other side of it. A myth is a way of explaining reality. You invoke a myth because by analogy, it explains something for you. The myth of the
Hmm.
frontier, the spirit that took us, to the Pacific coast, explains something about the spirit that drives Elon Musk. Okay? There's a connection there. We apply it, and it explains something for us. We've done this a lot with the Good War since 1960, when I think that myth was really completely formed. And it's had some bad effects. We applied it in Vietnam, and it didn't
Hmm.
work. It turned out that the good war was a bad war. We applied it in the first Gulf War, and it seemed like we had a good war again. In fact, the president said as much. It's no Vietnam, not Vietnam, it's World War II. We fought Hitler again. This time it was Saddam Hussein, but it was Hitler, and
Hmm.
we won. And it turned out that the victory was hollow and bogus. And September 11th, and we go into Iraq again, and we're told that it's a good war, that he's Hitler, that he's going to get an atomic bomb. And it turns out to be a lie. And we go
Right.
into Afghanistan to fight the savages, right? And to put the savage, and it turns out we can't do it. It's not right. We have misconceived it somehow. We've screwed it up. It doesn't work. And so the myth weakens. Its appeal weakens. Now I tell you, the Ukraine war is a good war. It is like you have to stop Hitler in 1938. And that's what we're saying. That's what people are saying. And it's not gripping, it's not taking hold because we've been tricked too often with that story. And the myth
Hmm.
has lost its hold. Doesn't mean it has lost it forever, but you can see that its hold has been weakened in the society, as in a way the frontier myth has been weakened by
Hmm.
the threat of global warming.
So let me jump up to the present then. You did
Yeah,
a little bit already, but just so we can get to talking about what's going on today in politics around us and the election that's ongoing and upcoming at the same time. So in your last few chapters, you talk about the Biden administration, and
yeah,
at that point, the Biden campaign, which is now, of course, the Harris campaign, but it was the Biden campaign while you were still finishing your book, and the Trump presidency. And you talk about how they incorporate the national myths into their governing
yeah.
ideology, into governmental practices and policies. Um, So can you just tell us more about how does the MAGA movement and how does the other side, the Harris, Biden, blue movement, how do they tap into some of these mythologies today? And have they had to reinterpret them in some way to make them work for what they want to do, what they want to accomplish in today's world, which obviously is very different than it was for when these myths were first developed?
Right. Okay. The MAGA side is easy because they're
Yeah.
using the traditional myths in traditional ways. Their economic doctrine is the frontier, uh, pure and simple. In fact, if you look at the Koch brothers website for a while, had a thing called economic frontiers. There was an automobile frontier and an energy frontier. And then the energy frontier featured what they called freedom fuel. So,
Oh,
get into that Arctic Wild River, you're not just going to tap fuel, you're going to get a freedom gusher with it. So the MAGA theory of economics is the frontier theory, that if you simply deregulate everything and turn people loose to exploit the ground, everybody is going to benefit. Democrats fell for this too. A rising tide lifts all boats. Right.
mhm.
Okay. So that's the frontier theory. The second thing, the lost cause. I've already spoken about that. To reestablish the moral and political authority of white, native-born Christian men. That's the cultural theme that's all about. And it has certain ideological things that it brings with it, like a particular stance on abortion, a particular stance on immigration, and so on. But that's basically what it's about. It's the lost cause. And I must add that you use violence. And here's where the myth of the founding comes in. On January 6th, there were three banners that were particularly important. Confederate battle flag, lost cause. Betsy Ross flag, American Revolution, not the Constitution, the revolution, the overthrow of the government. And the Don't Tread on Me flag, the yellow flag with the rattlesnake, which
Mhm.
is a flag of the anti-tax movement and the anti-gun and the gun rights movement.
Program.
And
Mhm.
what's key about the gun rights movement is that it uses a myth of the founding, the belief that the Second Amendment protects the right of people, of individuals, to arm themselves uh, for the purpose of overthrowing a tyrannical government. So that what they've done is what that flag does is to turn the Constitution into a license to kill, which is critical if what you want to do is
Mhm.
storm the Capitol.
Mhm.
But that program of the revolutionary flag, the frontier vigilantism, um, uh, and the gun rights are all myths that rationalize and justify the use of violence for political ends. And that's the
Mhm.
essence of MAGA. Violence takes many forms, some literal in the use of guns, but it's the threat of guns, people getting death threats online, which they believe because Americans are so heavily armed and because our
Mhm.
laws, stand our ground laws, give a wide license for people to use their guns in public. And that's the MAGA side of the story. Now, the left has a,
Let me add one more piece to that, which is the
yeah, sure.
lost cause of the 2020 election.
Oh,
To
yeah. Well, yeah.
me,
Yeah.
you're right. That's the other
Yeah.
law. That's the new
Yeah.
lost cause. It's the
Yeah.
same. There's a mythology around what happened there, who
That's right.
actually won, where the votes go, all this stuff that doesn't have any empirical support behind it. But yet the mythology is so powerful right now, and
Yes.
it's really a second lost cause that plays around the same old tropes. It's also about here's this white man, this powerful white man. He's a revolutionary. He's strong. He's whatever, and yet somehow he lost.
Yes.
Like the South somehow lost. The South shouldn't have lost that battle, that war, but it did. Trump shouldn't have lost that election, but he did in some unfair way. So I see it as sort of a second lost cause.
Yeah. Yeah. So this time around, the restoration of rule by Trump is the justification for violence. And again, violence in a figurative sense, the manipulation of the law, the overthrow of laws and regulations around voting rights is another form of another way of doing violence to the constitutional order. The left use of myth is really problematic in a few ways. The Lincoln image is, of course, always there. It's been complicated for us by all the work that's been done on the racism of Lincoln and of the Union side of the war. But two things. The left in this country is interested in reform. And the prelude to reform is critique, is criticism. Instead of building up or building on traditional stories, you criticize those stories. You point out that Jefferson, the flaw in Jefferson is that he's a slaveholder who talks about equality. That Lincoln is essentially a man who believes in white supremacy, even though he also liberates the slaves. And there is no the good war had been since the 1960s the go-to myth for liberalism. Even Obama constantly invoked the image of the military as Americans all, not caring about their differences, all working together for a common cause. So the good war myth is very much part of the liberal myth. It's been complicated for us by the failure of our recent wars. Now, there are two elements in the history of the American left that ought to be stories well known to the public, stories that are told to exemplify what liberalism is about. The story of the New Deal and the story of the Civil Rights Movement. And neither has acquired the kind of cultural presence that the Good War or the Civil War has acquired. The New Deal is arguably the most transformative period in American social and economic history. And by the New Deal period, I mean everything from 32 through the end of Lyndon Johnson's administration. It's utterly transformative. How many movies have been made about those transformations? How many movies made about the struggles of the labor movement in the 1930s? How many movies about TVA and the vast public works programs of the New Deal that restructured the nation, for that matter, the building of the interstate highway system? No, the values of those things were in a way subsumed in the good war myth. That was the kind of country our mixed platoon was fighting for, but not the reforms themselves, because the reforms are an exception to the rule of how American government and the American economy works. It's regulation, not deregulation. It's planning, not freeform capitalism. It's not the market. It's not the market. It's a different set of values. And in that way, it's an exception to the rule of America. And it's one of the reasons, I think, why there is no myth of the New Deal in the way that there is a myth of the founding or a myth of the lost cause. And the second component, but yet, reference to the New Deal is critical to the liberal program in the present day. You see it.
Well, and Biden talked about that, right? Biden talked about the New Deal and how what he was doing was just like what FDR did back in the 30s and 40s. And
the New Deal, the Green New Deal, it's there. And Biden did invoke it. During the campaign, I emphasized this in the book because that was where my research essentially ended while the campaign was on. He goes to Warm Springs, Georgia, to make a speech about social policy. He goes to a site sacred to the memory of FDR to make that speech. He goes to Gettysburg to make a civil rights speech. Lincoln. And there's the second component of liberalism is the civil rights movement. And the civil rights movement has become mythic in the sense that it's a scenario that we understand for a minority group or a discriminated against group to achieve something like social equality. That you organize a movement, you protest peacefully, you work through protest towards legislation, and through legislation you transform the society. But what happened in the wake of the civil rights movement was that instead of becoming a single national story, it became a story for different groups struggling for their own ends of identity politics, in effect, and lost its force as a national myth, as a national story. It's not the story of the nation. It's the story of Black people. It's the story of women. It's the story of gay people. It's the story of Native Americans. And what's needed and what Biden seemed to be trying to do, and what I think the left ultimately has to do, is to integrate the story of social economic reform and social justice embodied in the New Deal and centered on things, the problems of capital and labor, and the race, gender inequality issues that are associated with the civil rights movement, and make social justice possible in a society like ours, where race and gender difference are critical ways of dividing the population.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's been so much pushback in recent years on that whole effort, right? So all the anti-DEI, the anti-affirmative action, overthrowing of all those policies that we had in place that were moving, or based upon the civil rights movement,
Yes.
Going toward justice, social justice, and they're all being pushed back on and defeated all over the country right now. So that's really it's a losing proposition right now, it seems to me, and I'm not sure how that could get turned around anytime in the near future to make that a winning proposition, based on ideas that all Americans, or at least many Americans on both sides of the spectrum, will agree with. And so I
Well,
don't know. So going forward, what is it they could possibly do to what mythology? Because you talk about this a little bit in the end of the book, is developing new mythologies, especially on the left. And it seems like it's an impossible task to me. But I want to hear you talk about
it,
what that might look like.
it's a huge task. The way that myths are not invented on the spot. Even the Hollywood good war myth didn't emerge pop out of the screenwriter's head. It wasn't really mythic. It didn't become a public property until 15 years later, until usage over 15 years of telling that story that way, finally said, okay, now I understand how a whole phase of history can be
Mm-hmm.
characterized. You make culture by talking about it. You make culture by telling stories. The only way to get the New Deal civil rights story told is to tell the New Deal civil rights story. The difference here, you're talking to a cultural historian, not someone in the electoral process. To win the
Mm-hmm.
election, God bless. Do whatever you can. Say whatever, say whatever works.
And
I'm
they
good
do
with
that.
it.
I mean, both sides do that.
I'm good with it. But an election is for a day. The culture goes on and on. And the way you tell the story, the way you teach the story of America, the way you bring things forward that have been held in the rear, um, telling the story over time, if there is validity to that story, that is, if it really touches on something which is fundamental and true about the way the society works and the way the society sees itself, then it will gain force over time. Um, how long a time, I don't know. The Good War made its real impact, I would say, within 15 years. But that was such a phenomenal crisis, on which everyone's attention was riveted, and in which a picture of the war was the thing you had to look at and nothing else. I
Mm-hmm.
don't see anything comparable now. Maybe retelling the story of January 6th will do it, in a different way, pitching the conflict around January 6th in a different way. But the work of the culture will either establish it or not.
Mm-hmm. So let me give you a quote from your last chapter. You say that American democracy is caught in a potential death spiral in which our failure to find political solutions produces an enraged and aggrieved hyperpartisanship, which in turn makes it impossible for government to make the kinds of regulatory change and public investment needed to address the problems. To break our spiral, we must develop a durable social consensus about what has gone wrong and what should be done about it. You know, paraphrasing here, but one that sets parameters in which both parties can operate and compromise, and has the moral legitimacy, which is obviously a key part of this, conferred by a shared understanding of national myth. Again, this makes total sense to me. This needs to happen. And I'm wondering, I know we just talked about this, but sort of how is it going to happen? And who's going to do this? And I just wonder if we're looking to the elites to kind of promulgate this new mythology and spread it down. Is this kind of a top-down process? Is it bottom-up process? How might this actually happen, in our culture?
It'll be a kind of reciprocal process of stories thrown out by people who make stories, who write and publish stories, and people who receive stories, but also retell those stories.
Mm-hmm.
That's how the process would work. What I think, in the short term, what I was trying to say there is we need a theory of the modern economy to explain why it has screwed us up so badly, why wages keep stagnant and while the wealthy get wealthier. What is it that we've done that produced that kind of order, and what can we do about it? We have to first agree that that's a problem, and it's the function of the political leadership to focus us on that problem. There are signs that Harris is trying to do that kind of thing. Bill Clinton tried to do that thing, although I'm no fan of Bill Clinton. He had a wonderful story to tell about the nature of the economic crisis that has produced the discontent of the MAGA movement. It's a great story. It's a story that should be repeated more and more, but it's not being repeated. He's the only one who told it coherently. It's a failure of communication on the part of those who are leading the campaign. So you need a rational account of the crisis. You need a story of the crisis. And then you need a story of how we get out of the crisis. You need a story of the crisis. We're settlers on the edge of a wilderness. Holy crap. How do we get out of this? Well, we need Daniel Boone. We need Buffalo Bill. We need General Custer. They'll get us.
We should watch Survivor, and we learn how from watching Survivor how to get out of that situation.
That's right. That's right. And the reason that Trump is doing well is he offers himself as a hero. Hero of a lost cause. But he says that the problem is that the vermin have taken over, and he's going to throw out the vermin. Well, that's a theory of the case. That's an account of the crisis. The left has not offered to my satisfaction a similarly coherent view of what the problem is. The left is still too invested in capitalism, frankly. And I don't mean by that they have to go the full socialist route, but they've got to get over this mystique and their respect for the capitalists whose power has distorted the whole economy, and start saying, look, you've distorted the whole economy. You need to stop, and we need to do something to stop you. When that will happen, I don't know, but it's got to happen at some point.
And the left also tends to get bogged down in explaining everything. We tend to have complex stories. We don't have a simple story to tell. And that's one of the reasons why we've had some issues with trying to get folks to come out to agree with us, to believe in some of the things that we say, because things are just complicated out there, and we can't boil them down the same way as, say, Trump has been able to, or prior candidates have been able to, into 2 or 3 simple things. X, yes. Y, and Z. Okay, that explains the whole situation. Fix those things and we're done. And Democrats have historically spent, justifiably explaining things the way they should be explained, because the world's a complex place and there's no one cause that leads to an effect that we can easily separate or extinguish and change or what have you. But we tend to get bogged down on those details and this caveat and that caveat, and don't have simple stories to tell. We don't have those mythologies. So we can just grab a hold of one of those stories and say, okay, here's the story, plain and simple, and this is how we get past it.
Well, I think it is possible to tell a story that has complexity and conflict to it, and that looks at the contradictions in American character. I mean, young people have gotten used to characters like Spider-Man and the dark version of Batman. Problematic heroes are not that hard to sell. The question is really one uh, of how you present the complexity. You don't dump everything on everybody all at once, but focus on a story where you can develop some of the complexities and the conflicts, and yet show there's a kind of a through line that runs through it that makes a certain amount of sense. Eric Foner's History of Reconstruction is a
Mhm.
model of that. It's very complex, very detailed, but you can follow the through line of what's going on in a narrative sense. Um, and there's a I think he's done an abridged version of it that makes that through line even clearer than the original. That kind of thing can be done. Ken Burns, for all that I didn't like his Civil War thing, does some great stuff. PBS American Experience takes bits of the American stories and makes sense out of it. Focuses on something small, deal with the complexity of the story, and then reattach it to the larger structure before the program ends. There are ways of doing this. There has to be a disposition to tell the story, as opposed to a disposition to simply slap all stories down and say there's nothing worth remembering there.
Mhm. Well, and one could ask also, who watches those Ken Burns shows? It's mostly people on the left,
Well,
and
I,
they would need to sell. They would need to sell more than just ourselves on those stories, and that's where one of the culture divides become. It sort of sits right where you have the Prius versus the pickup situation with the Starbucks versus Dunkin' Donuts. We have this. We see different media exposed to different things. We buy different products, go to different stores, and sometimes sort of overcoming those gaps is pretty darn hard to do.
yes, I think that's true, but there's a large audience for the PBS stuff. People tell their friends. We neglected our teaching of history in public schools. And maybe the attack on the public schools by the right will snap some people out of it and get them to write textbooks that do the right work in an appealing kind of way. Um,
Mhm.
uh, it's our fault if we don't teach history.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jason Stanley's recent book on erasing history. So Jason Stanley is a philosopher at Yale, and he talks about. Let me just go back to my question here. The book is about how fascists, I think the subtitle, how fascists tend to change history to control the future or
Mhm.
revise history. And so some of the attacks we've seen on history textbooks across the nation, just in the past few years, even have been we need to stop telling that bad part of the story. We need to leave this other part of the story. And the idea is to refashion our national mythology and exclude or delete what we don't like about it and not talk about those things. And we've seen that. You're obviously been in higher education for a long time. You see higher education under fire because we're telling the wrong story, according to some people. And I don't think just fascists want to change history, but certainly that's one of the things that they want to do.
Mhm. Yeah. That's clearly one of the key political battles of the day is over the teaching of history. Um, my own feeling is I was not happy with the way history was being taught beforehand. The New Deal, for example, is neglected in most history textbooks. It's not given its proper force, um, and you need better text. But it's a culture war, and both sides have to be willing to fight it. So
Mhm.
fight for better textbooks. That's the only way it's going to happen. It's not going to, there's not going to be some, what is it? McGraw-Hill is going to do some huge great textbook dump and save secondary education. It's
No.
work that has to be done by academic historians, by uh, historical popularizers, a class of people
Mhm.
that I admire greatly, historical novelists, documentary filmmakers. Um, uh, the work of telling the stories, it requires the telling of the stories.
Mhm. Let me go to a couple of questions from the audience now.
Yeah,
So the first one is Professor Slotkin familiar with James Davison Hunter's recent book, Democracy and Solidarity? And if so, what do you think about that book? I don't actually know the book myself. It's one of the listeners is asking that question.
yeah, no, I have. I'm not familiar with that. I know his earlier work, but no. Is there some particular aspect of it that uh, interested you?
Yeah, that's the entire question. So I don't know what
Yeah,
else.
yeah,
They don't have anything else to add
yeah.
to
No,
that.
I'm not familiar with it, and I won't bluff.
Thank you for that. Now, another question about a book. Can you reflect on Christopher Lash's classic, The True and Only Heaven, as a potentially constructive path towards a more widely appealing liberalism?
Didn't read it either.
I did. I have not read that one either.
No, and you know, Christopher Lash has never been one of my go-to guys. So
The other question, do liberals progressives today have more or less comfort with engaging slash honoring various myths than do conservatives slash populists?
yeah, I think they have less. Yes, I agree. I think they have less comfort in embracing the notion of myth making than conservatives do. Responses that I've gotten to my own writing on this suggest, well, let the historians just write history. Don't worry about myth making. My definition, every time you write a history, you're making a contribution to the making of a myth. But I think a greater degree of consciousness about the power of stories and the necessity of getting the story right is really critical to the rhetoric of the left. The weakness that I see in the Harris's campaign is a failure of storytelling. It's not that the ideas are great. There's no problem with the ideas. How did we get to these ideas? What are these ideas rooted in? Where did they come from? Why are they necessary? What about the how did how did what kind of crisis did Biden face? How did he deal with it? And how is what we're doing going to do next? What we should do next, given what
Mhm.
has been done about it. Uh, Instead, they accept the rhetoric of the journalists, and what are you going to do that's different from Biden? What's the It's a silly question. What sense do you make? The question is, what sense do you make of how we got into this mess? And how are you going to get us out of it? Tell me a story about how we got into this mess, and then tell me the story of how you're going to get out of it. Organize it that way, not as a set of bullet points, but organize it to me as a narrative. And then you got something.
So a follow-up question from another audience member says, you spoke about the left having to criticize, which is a failure at some level rather than telling a myth. And he's asking, what do you mean by that? Just explain more about what you meant by that statement.
Yeah, I don't. What I mean is that there's a neglect of storytelling on the left, and unwillingness also to uh, to allow a positive story to emerge from the critique of what went wrong in the past. Now, I don't want to make a wholesale condemnation of everybody who writes history. I just want to talk about there's a tendency on the left uh, to, to, to pick away at things and miss the main point. Yeah, Lincoln had a 19th century white man's ideas about race. That's not interesting. The interesting thing is what he did with it, is what he did coming out of it. Um, uh, shouldn't that have more focus than all the things that were wrong about Abraham Lincoln in some sort of moral discussion about what history means, what it's about? Now, if you're writing an analytical biography of Lincoln's racial ideas, go for it. Rip away because you'd be absolutely right. But if you're trying to put together a, his, a history that has a moral to it, which is what a myth is, if you were trying to get at the moral core of what the history is about, not simply to get the facts right, but get at the moral core of it, then give the proper weight to the right side of it. I'm thinking, here again, the way rhetorical practice and physical political practice mirror each other. The George Floyd demonstrations in I think it was Madison, Wisconsin. They tore down the statue of a Union officer, a Norwegian American Union officer named Hans Hegg, who was an abolitionist, as if it was a Confederate statue. Um, Not all statues are bad. Not all statues are Confederate statues. You don't have to you don't have to um, you don't have to throw out what is heroic in figures like Jefferson and Washington and Lincoln. Uh,
Mhm.
while you're doing the critique, do the critique, but don't lose the other part.
So I want to ask you about actually another couple of books or ideas in the books. And I want to go back to the title of your book, A Great Disorder. You borrow that from Wallace Stevens' poem. In his poem, Connoisseur of Chaos, he writes, a violent order is a disorder and a great disorder is an order. So you say that we may well be entering a period of great disorder. What came to my mind when I was reading that were a couple of books I read last year. One was by Barbara Walter, who's a scholar of civil wars, all over the
Yeah.
world. She's been a part of this consortium of individuals who study these, and also a book by Stephen Marsh. Walter does not predict a civil war in the U.S. yet. She lays out the preconditions for one and suggests that many of those preconditions are actually here now. Not all of them, but many of them are. March goes further and states the Civil War has already started. He's arguing this is already going on. It's not going to look like the last Civil War, but it's already at a micro level with the militias and individual and the bullying and the violence that we're seeing, sort of micro at this point. This war has already started. And I
Yeah.
saw that in an interview you gave about the Civil War. You said Civil War is not going to happen. You seem pretty certain about that. And I just wanted to ask you, why are you so confident, confident or comfortable
Yeah.
saying you don't think this is going to happen?
Well, I don't think a repetition of the war between the states is going to happen, because
Mhm.
I don't think that's not the battle lines. Let me say what I meant by the great disorder is in order. I was comparing our situation to that of what was called the age of the New Deal order, um, when presidents of both parties accepted certain parameters for social action. You were going to, even conservatives were not going to undo Social Security or the New Deal. They were going to shift things a little bit in one direction. And Nixon is a classic example of that. And then you got, following Reagan, what Gary Gerstle calls the neoliberal order. When even
Mhm.
a Democratic president like Bill Clinton accepts the fundamentals of neoliberalism, that deregulation is better than regulation, that the marketplace is the primary driver of progress and prosperity. So you had two orders that established parameters within which compromise was possible and both parties could operate. What is the consensus now in the United States? The consensus is that there is no consensus and may never be
Mhm.
one again. So our order is the order of disorder, the order that there will be no order. Though the rules are that we are dividing. And I see the division really on the level of the states, in the red state, blue state, where you're beginning to develop two different legal regimes with respect to
Yes.
critical things like voting rights, uh, women's health care, race relations, gun rights, uh, uh, what is homicide and what is not, and what can and should be taught in the schools, separation of church and state, fundamental issues governed by a different set of laws in different states of the Union. Over time, that the acid of that, if that persists, will, I think, weaken the bonds of nationality in the
Mhm.
direction of something like the 1850s. I don't see a civil war as such with organized armies raised by whom marching to the
Hmm.
fray. However, as in the Reconstruction period, we will see massive waves of vigilante violence. That's what the militias are about. They're vigilante organizations. You'll see vigilante, or you'll see civil violence, political violence, assassination attempts, threats of assassination, which can be as powerful as assassinations themselves, race riots, mobs burning out immigrant communities, homeless encampments, temporary refugee camps, as happened in this country to the Okies during the Great Depression. Um, uh, so I see that kind of violence and that kind of disorder, and that if the people elect if the people elect Donald Trump, I see that as becoming endemic because
Hmm.
you'll have
So
government
it's,
sanction.
yeah, so it sounds like it's a little more consistent with what Stephen Marsh argues, the way you
Yeah.
describe those things. That's what he's arguing as well. So we're almost out of time, and those who have been watching me do this before know my last question is one I stole from Ezra Klein. And Ezra Klein, as maybe you know, he always asks his guests at the end of his hour and a half interviews, what are three books you'd recommend to the readers that in which they could read and learn more about the topic at hand, whatever that may be? So I'm going to make it simpler than that and ask you just for one book. So if you can recommend one book that, not one that you wrote, but one book that you would recommend people read to learn more about how mythologies work, how they interact with our politics in America in this day and age, what book might that be?
Oh, geez, that is a tough one. Um, Let me look at my bookshelf here. I I guess the guy that uh, I found most useful in understanding how we got here is Gary
Mhm.
Gerstle, and his book. Let me get the title exactly. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order.
I have
It's
that.
not
Yeah.
about mythology per se. There's a lot of different takes on mythology, and I've been following my own for so long that I can't really, I'm not really up on other people's theories, to be frank.
Mhm.
But that book I thought really set the context for me in a way that I found extremely useful, and I highly recommend it.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. And so, Rich, just want to thank you again for your time tonight. It's been a real pleasure talking to you and learning more about American history. And again, I loved reading your book. I want to go back and read the book again because it's so dense, it's so full of information and insight that I could read it three times in a row and still learn a lot, on a third reading. And I want again, thanks again to the Mark Twain Library and the Reading League of Women Voters. And I want to hand the virtual microphone back to Aaron Dumeyer.
On behalf of all our sponsors and supporters who made tonight's program possible, we extend our deepest gratitude to Richard Slotkin and Dan Barrett for joining us this evening. And it is with gratitude that we thank the staff and volunteers of the Reading League of Women Voters and the Mark Twain Library for making this production possible. This evening's conversation will be just as enlightening in rerun, so don't forget to spread the word about the library's YouTube channel. And of course, thanks to all who joined us here this evening. And have a good night.